Okay, if you've taken a basic economics course or studied economics in school or college, you are given a lot of functions, as they call them, mathematics. You are given a lot of graphs. Some of you may have been familiar with so-called supply and demand curves. You are given discussions of things called public policy and other stuff such as that related to it. What's my field of vision?
You're out of it now.
Okay. So I couldn't even get to the left side of the board by your focusing.
Now you can.
All right. We can move this whole thing back to the end, I suppose. Okay, whatever. I guess you'll worry about it. The concepts of economics have evolved through, well, let's write down some names that are worthy of noting, if nothing else is worthy of noting in this world. The people who've come up with the concepts that we currently live by and have built up. There are, I suppose it was originally spelled with a K back in Germany, the following people who have made great steps forward. And, of course, the greatest, and in some senses of them all.
Well, that's what's in economics.
Beg your pardon?
That's real economics or Austrian economics.
That's where we're starting from, as I just said. And I will add a couple more as we go along. These are the names to conjure by. These are the great sorcerers whose magic we will summon here. And perhaps there's one new one going to be added. I'll just put him in for completeness. In a sense, since we're sitting in, we're dealing in kind of authoritarian or disciplined mode here, which lends itself all too easily to argument from authority, let us stand by the following. These are the only people I consider authorities in the field of economics. So if you want to bring up other people or discuss other people or argue about other people, that's fine. If we want to simply say, well, let's agree on this and go on from here, these are the ones which I will do. Each of these people made, roughly in this order, important contributions, critical contributions to economics, in the same way that Albert Einstein and Erwin Schrödinger, perhaps Werner Heisenberg, made in theoretical chemistry or physics, depending on your point of view, which courses you took. In the beginning, there was, of course, people like Adam Smith. Smith had problems with many of his basic concepts, but he was first in line, right? He came up with all sorts of interesting ideas, but he was highly elementary. In his thinking, he came up with an incredibly bad concept. He didn't know any better. He didn't know what to do with it. So let's go back here to in the beginnings, 1776. A year that you should conjure with in other areas. In the beginning, Adam Smith, following the concepts of natural law, which were developing at the time, in other words, he was looking at these things, at people acting around him as a scientist would. He was, as a scientist, was looking at particles bouncing around, atoms, and so forth. He was very early on in doing things this way. The French physicists were slightly ahead of him in this, but basically, from art, English, and so forth, going down, he started off that way. And he made very many valuable contributions, and a lot of them were taught in basic economics and so forth. But he also had problems with a couple of items, which we're going to cover here, and which became problems henceforward. The reason I need to cover these is that if any of you, and at least a couple of you, have backgrounds or dealt with people who have an anarchist tradition in which they have severe problems with these things. There's good reason that they have. Anarcho-communists, for example, are not perverse necessarily, or intransigent, or refuse to listen to reason. They have a tradition which comes about because this Adam Smith, who was originally a moral philosopher, there was no such thing as economics when he invented it, of course, just as today one could say there's no such thing as counter-economists, in the sense of teaching it. Adam Smith in 1776, he came up with, among other things, the theory of moral sentiments, and the theory inquiring into the causes and so forth of the wealth of nations. And with that, economics was declared, and he came up with the following concepts. Now, I didn't go into adjectives on these two, but essentially all three of these are wrong. This was Adam Smith's beginning, and this is where he went wrong. In the labor theory of value, the problem was this. Again, like thinking like a scientist, you're trying to always break things down and look, to the fundamentals, what's causing anything else. If you're a chemist, you try to get down to the atoms, and if you want the atoms, you want to know how the atoms and particles interact, electrons and bonds and so forth. So he wanted to know what's the basic unit or the basic stuff, material of value. Human beings are exchanging things. They exchange, that's of course basic economics. They trade material goods and immaterial goods, as it turns out, as well. And they value them. There is a reason that I want something from you and you want something from me. It's a form of valuation. Where does this value come from? Is there some common denominator that we can perceive in this? Well, Smith thought he could, and others who followed him came up with the idea that the amount of work that went into producing something was a fixed amount, something fixed and basic, and could therefore be utilized to ascribe value. If you could figure out how much work went in, maybe fiddle with a couple of minor parameters, you could figure out how much anything is worth. Now, in issues of these other things, in interest and rent, he also did not have a strong or credible concept in here. He also had a little problem with the concept of profit, which all of these are going to tie in a minute to the ostrich. They are, in my opinion, their great value is that they solved all these problems. They put them on a true scientific basis, and in fact, what I consider the science of economics or praxeology, or which Mises uses the term, begins with Menger and not before. What existed before that was a descriptive attempt, something like biology is today, where in fact they don't know what's really going on. They don't know the basic atomic structure as they do in physics and chemistry. They simply take a lot of notes and observations of what goes on and go on from there. Okay, so Smith came up with a bunch of ideas. In these particular areas he was wrong. In a lot of other areas, I'm not even going to waste time on here, he was incredibly right. He was very good on things like the laws of comparative advantage, the laws of absolute advantage, as they were called when I was first coming across this stuff. Why people trade, what's the value of free trade, why any attempts to get in the way of free trade are counterproductive and end up with net losses to one or both, and the summation of exchanges will also be a net loss. All sorts of things like this Smith was good on, and all the ones who followed him, Ricardo, and up until modern times. These remained a sticky problem, however, and there began to become divisions in the 19th century over how to solve them, on what kind of things to ascribe to value, and how to deal with interest, rent, and profit. We also got little side trips with Malthus and his geometric versus
arithmetic.
Mathematic and use linear, and basically the two curves of a straight line growth or linear growth versus a hyperbolic, or as he called it, a geometric from the geometric series concept. And as you can see, that food is never going to go as fast as the people, according to him. Of course, there's nothing to say that if you increase the total. These were all based on assumptions, such as that there was a fixed amount of land, and at the time it seemed like maybe there was. In the 19th century, we had colonized much of the planet, and while there was still a lot of expansion going on, they felt that would have to end eventually, and that would be the end of it. Nowadays, we more enlightened people, I think, have this view that we can continue expanding land indefinitely out through space, terraforming planets, building L5 colonies, and so forth. And therefore, this line here, the base of it can be raised up indefinitely according to the land amount. The problem with land also led other people into strange territory. Rent, in particular, led the Henry Georgists, the followers of Henry George, off into weird directions. The problems with interest and what it means and where it comes from led in the 1920s to Major Clifford Hughes Douglas and the social credit movement, attempting to solve what they thought they had the solution to, and then attempting to win the people over to that and end the great banker conspiracy, which in fact does exist, but that's either here nor there. Their economic understanding of why it was is wrong. And the concept of profit led a guy named Karl Marx off into an interesting direction, because he couldn't figure out, as did Smith, exactly what profit was and why it should exist. Okay, so this is sort of where it all comes from. Around the turn of the century, around 1900 or a little before, there was also a whole other school that came up, which we may or may not have to deal with. Guys named Irving Fisher and a guy named Marshall and a few others, who eventually led to their economic descendants, Milton Friedman and the so-called Chicago School. They went off in a whole other line of deviation, differences. What Menger came up with was a solution to the key one here that began all this. Menger came up with a concept which is absolutely critical to the understanding of all economics, and we hope that all of you are now familiar with, of course, and that is the theory of subjective value. Once you've got this premise, if you don't have this premise, or if you reject this premise, then much of everything else we're going to deal with will not follow. If you do have this premise, then I think you'll pretty well be able to figure out as we go along why we're doing what we're doing and how things evolve the way they do. Subjective value theory simply says that you and I value things differently according to what individually we are. We do it totally subjectively. There is no objective base for our ascribing a value to this. If I want to exchange this book and one of you has a notebook and we're looking and deciding, well, should I keep this book, should you keep your notebook, or should we make a trade, we are going to sit here and make a rapid series of calculations, almost at this point instantaneous. You'll look at your notebook and say, well, I value it less than this book. I will look at it and I'll say, I value your notebook less than this book too. Therefore, you are willing to offer your notebook for this book, which you value more for, but I am not willing to offer this book, which I value more than your notebook, for your notebook, which is to me less value. No trade occurs. On the other hand, if I have 4 or 5 of these books, and I look at this particular one here, and I look at your notebook, which I don't have one of, I may decide that I like that notebook, in this particular case, I like that notebook better than this book. You like this book better than the notebook. We trade, and both of us have satisfied subjective value. If there was such a thing as objective or intrinsic value, which many people postulated, then these trades could never happen. Somebody would always lose in every trade. There are people who have this sort of negative sum theory of economics, and they have developed some interesting theories, but all of them, strangely enough, have a large proportion of what's called exploitation concept in their theory. Somebody's being exploited, somebody's being ripped off. Okay, so that's the subjective value theory, and of course what it does is it answers this. Labor theory is wrong. Labor can be totally wasted. Labor is not in itself a value. It may be, in fact, to the laborer, as people like this have pointed out, the labor itself is a disvalue. It's something nobody wants to labor for nothing. The joy of the worker leaping up in the morning and rushing off to, satisfy himself with 8 hours of strenuous effort doesn't exist.
Except for Karl Hess.
Even Stakhanov, the great Russian worker that was supposedly great on this, undoubtedly had psychological motives above and beyond the performance of the simple acts that he was supposedly doing in the assembly line. Undoubtedly, maybe he likes the hero of the Soviet Union medallions weighing him down on wherever they were pinned. But as far as labor, the fact that labor has the intrinsic value is ridiculous. Simple examples that Balvay and others come up with is, what about buggy whips? In 1901 or something, or in fact, you probably have to go back to like 1861 at this point. A buggy whip had value, and a nice, well-crafted one you spent a lot of work on, had even more value. But even a simple one that you could just toss off an assembly line had certain people go out and pay money for it, or trade or barter, whatever was necessary. But come 1910, you couldn't give them away. Everybody was going around in cars, right? The Model Ts and so forth. Buggy whips plummeted down. The same amount of work went in. As far as we know, there was no great advances in the production modes of making buggy whips. Yet the desired value for them have gone. Now, of course, the reason I had to cut it off in 1910 is that nowadays there are so few of them left that they might become collector's items. But if they did, let us say they did, now that the buggy whips, which we went for, and we'll equal out the dollars, because that's a whole other issue to talk about the exchange and inflation here. But in fact, what would happen is that the buggy whip, which in say 1980s dollars would be, might have sold for $10 a buggy whip in 1870, went down to fire sale levels at 10 cents a piece for in boxes of 100 if they could get rid of them in 1910. Today, if you found one, you might in fact be paying $50, $49.95 for this antique item to hang over your mantelpiece, or maybe even $99.95 or whatever if it was a handcrafted one and they could apply a name to an artist on it, maybe even a few $100s. So in all those cases, exactly the same labor went in, but the valuation has changed drastically. Where did the value change? The only place it could have been the subjective value of the consumer, of the person wanting it. And so there goes labor, out the window. You want to have a question before you go on interest?
Yeah, I was going to ask you what the normal Marxist or labor theory of value person responds to that example.
Well, those of us who've been in sciences, and I include computer sciences and mathematics, are well aware that when a theory begins to leak, you start putting on ever more intricate patches. There becomes sort of a negative labor theory of theories here, where the more the theory begins to fall apart and the lower its value, the more labor you pump in to try to keep it afloat. And the case of Marxism, and of course some of the modern Marxists are really fun to talk to because their level of patchwork has become that of a 17th century quilt artist of medieval France or something. In order to make these things work, because what they do is they constantly add on more correction factors. If you put in enough correction factors, everything will work. They talk about various forms of labor. For example, what's capital? They have to deal with that immediately. Capital to a Marxist is frozen labor. So now we've got different temperatures of well-chilled labor. and we go on at this level. I mean, it gets quite hairy. They talk about the forms of the cross-border exchanges and so forth. It adds up to collectives and how it can be broken down, whether or not it wears out with time, and what's actual labor and what's wasted labor and what's kept in the product. And of course, if you make enough correction factors, it's like if you take a sum of 1 plus x, well, plus or minus, but 1 plus x squared plus x, with fudge factors, a, b, c, etc. You can make it fit any function, including whatever. I don't know if you guys are familiar with enough with math to know what I'm talking about, but you can make it come up to something like e to the x, as long as you go to infinity and as long as you keep adding more and more correction factors. Basic mathematical truth. So in a sense, the modern Marxists are sort of approaching it. But what are they approaching? What are they using when a mathematician uses this kind of thing, or a chemist, or a scientist, or people in computer science? Right, I don't remember where we interrupted, so we'll just keep on going from there. Labor theory of value, Adam Smith, Carl Menger, subjective theory of value, bam, gone. Moving on.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
What is banker conspiracy referring to in connection with was it interest or rent or something?
Well, there isn't. Well, that's an entire interesting topic in what I would call revisionist history. That is to say, historically, there have been people who have gained by the fact that governments can control the money supply by use of sufficient force, and by doing so, this will get to be more interested in counter-economics in some areas, but by doing so they can manipulate the rate at which money is exchanged, which has some bearing on the interest rate. We'll be about to get to that, and therefore can make appropriate profits. Well, the word profit is incorrect there too, but we're going to get to a correct definition of profit in a minute. But can acquire money or value that they didn't otherwise have and that they clearly wanted. Be very careful in our use of terms here until we define them. Okay, interest. What are these things? Okay, as it turns out, these three are groupable to some extent, except for profit is going to be broken down into two concepts. Well, let us, at this point, I guess I'm going to have to thank you, Carl Menger, and we'll move on. Oh, before I get into that, then why don't I briefly take care of Eugen Böhm-Bawerk. Böhm-Bawerk had a concept, several concepts, but the one that I particularly remember for is a concept called the capital pyramid. His idea was, and this has to do with things called factors of production, but basically, if you want to make something and then sell it, you first got to deal with the tools. In fact, even after you make it and the tools, nowadays you have to worry about things like distribution. If I make a product, how do I get it to the person who wants it? So there's a whole series until we get to the final end, so to speak, of the end product. There's all these layers that have to be of steps of production. And each of them requires investment and therefore capital. So you get what's called the capital pyramid. This sounds incredibly obvious. In fact, there's a sort of simplified version of this in most economics texts when they talk about capital and factors of production. But the thing about Böhm-Bawerk is that he put it into this particular form in which when investment, the way he talks about it, basically, say if you add money into the system, you can see it, it'll flow up the capital pyramid, and actually, in a sense, the way I've got it here is kind of upside down. It goes generally the other way, but it doesn't matter. As the money goes in, it tends to build up more and more layers on top, and therefore you will have ever longer periods of production. Some of the stuff is not going to be immediately relevant to you, so it's only going to come up if you want to argue about some of the finer points. But this is why Böhm-Bawerk is important, and in fact, this whole concept of capital and interest, as the book was called, leads directly to von Mises, and it's still an incredibly valuable concept today in most economics, and was not in existence before Austrianism.
You see the source of the idea that the more a laborer has tools to increase his productivity, the higher the standard of living of the laborer and everyone else?
Not really. It's not. I mean, it does come out that way, but it's not obvious from the from his.
Did he formulate that idea?
No, not that particular idea.
Well, that came from what they later become.
Perhaps. It's not. See, it's not an obvious statement. Just because somebody has more tools does not mean they have a higher standard of living. They might be operating inefficiently. Anyways, Mises is where most of this modern stuff, which we're about to get to, comes in. And with Mises, who accepts the subjective value theory of Wenger and the capital pyramid and so forth, the capital structure of as mapped out by Böhm-Bawerk, Mises gives us the key issue which solves the rest of these problems. Where it comes from is can be approached several ways. One way is thinking in terms of the future versus the present. And the other way is what's called, or almost the same thing, is something called time preference. Okay, what does this mean? Real quick. Time preference is simply this. If all other things being equal, a term which Murray Rothbard loves to use the Latin version of, ceteris paribus, all other things being equal, if I have a choice of having $1 now or $1 next week, I'll take the $1 now. Okay? All other things being equal. I mean, that includes savings, how easy it is to carry it around, whether or not somebody's outside the door ready to mug you, and you know, and so forth and so on. Assuming that none of that enters into the picture, would you rather have $1 now that you can go out and spend or not spend as you choose, have the freedom to do so, or would you wait a week and get the $1 later, or for that week of time you would have absolutely no control over that $1 and be able to use it? I use $1, it's the same thing with a book or anything else. It is true that in very limited circumstances, that is, circumstances meaning that all other things are not equal, that in fact you might want to defer accepting something. For example, you might want to save because at a certain point of time you find it most convenient to travel, or you like the season of the year, you want to go there and so forth. That's an additional factor. That is not ceteris paribus. Okay, so that would be yet another value that you're acquiring. As Murray Rothbard says, the ultimate value is if you want a Coca-Cola, you want a Coke trickling down your throat right now. Anything else than that is additional factors of production. If your Coke is over here and you're over here, it's not trickling down your throat. You have to get it from over there to over here and then trickle it. If the Coke is in a machine out there, you've got to go out to that machine or send somebody out to get it. There's another cost of production. If you don't know that Coca-Cola exists, but you just have the vague concept that you want something cold and high caffeine and high sugar load of phosphoric acid trickling down your throat, the information costs that get involved. You have to get that too. So these are all the factors that can enter into it.
So could you redefine time preference as just saying value is not fixed with respect to
No. No, time is the fact is time preference itself. What I was bringing in was all the other factors. Given all those factors equal, given an exactly similar set of circumstances, people want something now rather than later. This is the universal. There are few. Austrian economics has few universals, and they're powerful ones. Another one, which is one of my favorite, is the equivalent of the principle of least human action, which is to say that people always attempt to do as little as possible to accomplish their ends. They like to put out as little effort as they can. Again, all other things being equal. Some paths might create great associations, or maybe you'll run into more attractive members of the opposite sex, and therefore you'll go a long way around. But that's not all other things being equal. That's another value being satisfied, you see? Okay. But again, all other things being equal, people want something now rather than later. Present money, in particular, money being a unit of value, as we're going to be using it, is always value over future money. Well, let's take a very brief side trip into money here. What is money? Okay, almost all of you have kind of heard this from your pre-libertarian days, conservative days even, probably when you ran into somebody who whipped out $1 and said, there's the Illuminati on it, and went away on a big long lecture from there on. What is money? It's a valid, okay, the basic concept is it is a medium of exchange. Exchange is what economics is all about. You've got something, I got something, we trade it. We've already gone through that. But how many of these books do you want for how many of those notebooks? Now we get complicated. We need to have some way of figuring out how to make this exchange. How do we divide it up? How do we make unit? What's a basic unit? Something fundamental. Well, it turns out in the marketplace, another concept that I should probably define independently here. Marketplace, as I use it, is simply the sum of human action. All people exchanging, all the exchanges being committed by voluntary human actors, in some cases involuntary too. The Austrians attempt to not distinguish, although they do smuggle their ethics and eventually. Money then is what we're going to just simply use it as a medium of exchange. There are all sorts of money. Once you've taken a broad definition, and then you get into fiat money, hard money, and M1, M2, M3, and all the Chicago School fantasies. What we're going to use here, if unless otherwise specified, we'll assume that it is a spontaneously generated market commodity that everybody in the marketplace is willing to accept, and in the sense of at least exchanging it for something else which they'll accept, and find it readily easy to do so. Gold often has evolved spontaneously through history. It is not absolutely essential to the basics of economics that gold be the money, but interestingly enough, historically, it always turns out that it is. I think the elemental properties of gold happen to fit the concept the best, and until we synthesize something else that will, in fact, the very fact that we can synthesize it's probably going to rule against it. We're going to probably be highly gold-oriented. Okay, we have a medium of exchange. Again, it doesn't have to be medium exchange in the sense that it could be you want grain delivery, you want a pile of metal for working on something, you want a herd of horses to go out in the range and round up your cattle or something. Whatever it is, you'd rather have it now than later. Again, all of the things being equal. Well, what is the difference between these two? If we take a present money and it's worth more, and we subtract the future money, which we're discounting. What is future money? Now, this is a term that you get, it sounds kind of science fictional. Future money is simply a promise to pay, really, and how much you trust it. It doesn't exist now. In the future isn't here. This is not the future, right? It doesn't exist. We have an existential problem here. So unless you want to retreat into Sartre, you will simply make an assumption that this is some sort of promissory thing, which in the past you've had a good record and so forth. You're not a large presence in the libertarian movement and find that it doesn't pay, in which case you'd have a very low value present of future money, and the difference would be quite high. If, on the other hand, you're dealing with somebody and you think that they're very likely to pay, this future money is going to be pretty close to present money, you're sure it's very close. Let us say, this is where we really get to the nitty-gritty of what Mises and those did. Let's say there's a 100% chance. Let us say you're sure that you're going to be paid 1 week from now or 1 year from now $100. You still would rather have the $100 to use all this coming year. There's still a difference. That future money is still worth less. You can't do things with it. You can't have that control. You can't not buy or buy as you figure. You have to wait that year until the future money is in your hand. With 100% security, there's still a difference. That difference is always greater than 0. And the name we give to it, or the name that Mises gave to it, is originary interest. Not a very great name, but originary interest. And this is what time preference generates. Time preference generates something called originary interest. Well, what is interest itself? Is interest just that? No, it's got a little more to it than that. However, it also has, before we even get into those things, we will notice that there's a connection between these two right now. Rent and profit. What is rent? Well, it turns out rent is exactly the same as originary interest. All it is specifically applied to land rather than money. We have present land, land sub present, versus land sub future. And what does that mean? Well, present land, I own land. Okay, everybody around me accepts that I am the owner of this land. That's our hypothesis. Now, I can keep it, I can do all sorts of things with it, I can play with it, I can build latrines in it, I can set up an Agorist Institute in it, there are all sorts of things I can do or not do. I can sit there and let it fly fallow and contemplate land and its greatness. Whatever I want to do, it's mine, it's my subjective value. Danny comes along here and says, I want the land. I've got a use for it. I'll pay you for it. What should I charge him? Well, I don't know. Let's see. How long are you going to have it and are you going to use it? I'm not going to, let's say I'm not going to sell it to you. I'm only going to give it to you for a certain length of time and you're going to return it. Okay, a year from now, I get the land back. Therefore, my present land is suddenly converted to future land. It's land that I will have a year from now, but it's not land that I have right now. Oh my God, there is a difference. For that year, I cannot build latrines on it or build an Agorist Institute on it or commit all sorts of immoral or fun, naughty acts on it, right? Therefore, I've lost value. My subjective value is gone. What do I do? Well, once again, we're exactly in the same position as money. There's a difference. There's a difference is always greater than zero. And the thing is exactly, it turns out, the same as originary interest. There's a good reason for it. The name, however, that it should be given is rent. And that's where rent comes from, and that's why rent exists. It is not a plot of the evil landlord conspiracy. It actually would exist on a totally free market. As you see, we've made no assumptions of government, we've made no assumptions of the state, we've made no assumptions of intervention in the marketplace. We've just had a bunch of people sitting around saying, I own some land, I don't want to use it, let's trade. And that's all that happened. Rent exists, yes.
What do you say to the people that will point out that you're making psychological assumptions about human beings?
The psychological assumptions, in fact, are covered in particular Mises' Human Action, because he goes right back to the beginning. He doesn't delve in psychology in the sense of any great depths, okay. What he does is he makes certain basic assumptions from the nature of human beings. Now, people can act contrary to nature. Remember, all this is subjective values, so therefore one can have values which are irrational, immaterial, counterproductive, self-destructive. There are all sorts of people self-destructing all around you constantly, right? I don't know what the suicide rate is out here, but it's pretty high. In fact, people who are in college, since we happen to be in a sort of college setting, have a very high suicide rate, it seems. So, fortunately, there are no exams in this course, so therefore I don't think any of you will be dropping out by that particular mechanism. So that's, in a sense, the answer. What I'm saying is it doesn't matter what your theory, what your psychology is. If your psychology is, how shall we say it, such that you would want to give away the land to Danny that you happen to own at that time and take a loss, generate a negative rent, what you're in fact saying is that you are getting a subjective value from this form of what I believe the psychologists would call masochism. And in fact, that's a highly positive value to you. Just like going into a bar and getting a person of the opposite sex clad in the appropriate scanty amount of leather and taking out a big buggy whip, perhaps, and using it on you might be a value that you would in fact pay a lot of money for. And that's exactly the kind of value that would be involved here, where you would attempt to go counter to the laws of economics. One of the points, or one of the objective realities, remember, just because value is subjective doesn't mean anything else in here is. Okay, we can objectively see the results of your subjective value. You either made a trade or you didn't. I can see that. You know, that X was in your possession, that was in his possession, and it's therefore something is physically moved in reality. There's all sorts of objective consequences here. Some of our modern libertarian friends, allies, comrades, and travelers on the road to spiritual enlightenment have seemed to wandered off in this particular area. They suddenly, they go from subjective value to subjectivizing everything. It's sort of like beating a good idea far past its value, or beating it to death, or whatever. It doesn't apply. It's not true. Subjective value is exactly that, and it doesn't go any further. In fact, there are objective consequences to running in the opposite direction of where all these indications are going. If you like to generate extra effort, if you want to put in more work than is necessary, you will probably quickly burn yourself out. If you attempt to always operate at losses in these particular areas, you'll quickly use up whatever you had, and you won't be in the market anymore. If you're renting out land at a loss, for example, you will soon find that you don't have any land anymore. Yeah.
What was it that Smith was saying about things like interest and rent and profit?
Getting back into Adam Smithianism there. Smith did not have a good idea of why things worked. He did not have a time preference concept. He knew that people lent money. Some ideas that Smith and some of the people immediately after him came up with as well. There was sort of a service charge involved, you know, and you had to kind of sit there and figure it out. And you know, there was accountancy involved and banking involved, and there were a lot of other areas we haven't even got into. Well, this is not the entire story of interest yet, and some of these bring in a little bit of statism as well. But So that those confused him. Those were additional things that have to be dealt with. But he did not have this basic original interest concept. If there were no service charges, which we're not even assuming here, they're so small we don't even think about them here. If there were no such thing as service charges, if there was no such thing as, we'll get into in a minute, as government manipulation of the money and ordinary risk factors, which would exist even without government, then, according to, as far as we can understand Smith, there would be zero interest. People would have money for nothing. And this is where the interest freaks, the money cranks as they're called, like C.H. Douglas in Canada, and there are a bunch of them like Benjamin Butler in the United States, the Greenback Party, Free Silver, all of them came from that concept. All these, the famous saying that we're all prisoners of some dead economist or other, worshipping some dead economist, is incredible. There is no such thing. I cannot think of a political movement of the 19th and 20th century that does not come from economics, does not come from an economic fallacy or, hopefully in a few cases, economic truth. And they simply hadn't figured it out. It takes time, people have to think, and they hadn't got it straight yet, and people ran off in all directions.
It's also true of profit, then, for Smith.
Profit, we're going to get to in a second. Rent is very much the same. Now, profit, I have to deal with slightly separately. What happens is the term is used in so many ways that I want to pin it down to Austrian. There's another reason I'm covering Austrians here is because I'm going to use terms specifically in an Austrian way. Interest is one of them. Profit's another one. These are used in an Austrian way. You will not find them used exactly that way, or even very closely that way in some Chicago School economics books or, basic textbooks, because they are smuggling in their own little concepts. Another one is inflation, which we'll get to in a minute, but since you brought it up, these are all things I'm going to use in an Austrian sense and not in common usage. Common usage has problems. Common usage has contradictions built into it. And therefore, in my opinion, it's not a valuable way to learn, using terms that are contradictory. Okay, profit is the third one here. Profit is two things. Well, let's go back to interest for a minute. I want to finish this one off, and then I can get to profit a little more easier, because you begin to understand how you break these things down. We're getting, since this is all we're dealing with now is Mises, we're giving him his due. Let's give ourselves some more room. It turns out that interest, in fact, has three factors in the real world, and the real world, unfortunately, today is statist. First of all, we have an originary interest. Now we know where that comes from, time preference. It's always going to be there. Even with 100% surety in the future, we still got our values, and they're still going to get in the way. Now we also have, and we will have in the marketplace until perfection is achieved, and until we have reached C.S. Lewis is further up and further in, and even then, the way he presents heaven, it may still exist. The factor known as risk, and this is extremely important to Austrians because it's where entrepreneurship comes from, and it will tie in, as you'll see instantly, into the concept of profit. The risk factor of interest. How likely is this person that you are lending money to, or some commodity which you want to get paid back for, to pay you back? How many of you think anybody is 100% risk? Even if you are not a large presence in the libertarian movement. Obviously, he would assign to a libertarian the risk factor that would be somewhere around maybe, I don't know, 20% or so or less, right? Others of us, trusting types like myself, perhaps might figure 95%. I mean, God, lightning bolt might strike you. God might decide he doesn't like libertarians tomorrow. And maybe you won't make it across the street to pay me off, even though you had the money in your hand and you made it. So we're talking about anywhere from 0 to 100. It's going to make a big percentage difference. Interest, by the way, is usually expressed in percentage terms. I think most of you have had even that basic level. Now the third factor, and this one I'm going to have to hold off on dealing with in any depth, is, how should I call it this time? Well, what it is a factor that's put in for inflation. And it results from, the only way it can come about is by state interference with money supply. Anything that, it is technically possible, theoretically possible, if you were a Friedmanite right now, if you were David Friedman, you'd leap up in your chair and accusatorily point at me and says, but what about, what happens if some private person decided to set up a money system and pump in all the extra paper, wouldn't you be inflating? And the point is that, again, this is a course ultimately in counter-economics, agorism in the real world. And Friedman constructs and hypotheses are occasionally interesting, might give us a little bit of enlightenment, but we're not going to get that philosophical. In the real world, such people are quickly driven out of the market. They're not your problem. You would lump them under the small category of charlatans, fast buck artists, quick trick types and so forth, who just want to see what they can con you out of and move on from there. Some of these have managed to get government backing, however, and become somewhat permanent institutions, but that's of course not something we want. And in fact, that's where it becomes, as I say, a government problem, and does. In the present state of society, as long as we have a significant status presence in society, which I assume all of us are interested in getting rid of, this is going to be yet another factor. What is that? What does it look like when you're sitting there and actually calculating your money? We're might as well do this right now, because one of the things I want to spend a lot of time with you is showing you how to calculate counter-economic things, so that you can do it in your day-to-day business effort. Well, I'll leaving it in the Counter-Economics 100 course when that comes up. Okay, once you sit down and decide your interests, you're going to say, he wants to borrow $100 from me. I'm going to sit down and think, okay, how long does he want for? A month. All right. What's it worth to me? Well, I've got $100 I can't spend, and boy, am I eager to spend it. He seems to be fairly eager too. Is he? Well, how eager is he? So we got to sit here. Well, the first thing, again, it's just like the books and the notebooks. I got to both sit here and compare subjective values. He knows what he's willing for that $100. He really wants that $100 for that month. He's willing to pay $200 for it. A month from now, he's going to give me $200 in future money. But he's not going to tell me that. He'd be a fool to bargain that way. He would first try to find out how little I'm willing to part with it. Because if it turns out it's over 200, then there's no point. He can't afford it. He doesn't want it that badly, and so forth. Okay, so we're gonna bargain. Now, what am I thinking when he comes and asks me for 100 and says he'll pay me extra? Well, I'm first interested in the loss of this, originary interest, the fact that my subjective values won't be satisfied for a month. That might be kind of small. I might actually say, well, a month from now I've got a lot of money flowing through. Yeah, I can make ends meet. I'm not going to really worry about it. $1 would probably suffice. $101 from now is probably the minimum that could actually get me over the edge. But how much of a risk is he? I look around. What's his track record? How many times do I think he's going to pay off and not pay off? So now we add another factor in here for that. Well, it turns out I think he's a fairly good risk. He's paid off several times. So there's a slight chance he might not come through, say 1 in 100. So I'll add $1 on for that. But we now exist in a system where we're dealing with dollars. So we somehow have managed to wander through the world without hearing about anti-Argus transporters or coins of gold or whatever. So we ask ourselves, because we happen to be dealing with commodity, I ask myself, what's the likelihood of this $102 that he might pay me back being worth $102? And in fact, the inflation rate currently is going at such a quick case that I probably would want another $2 just for that. Of course, this is divided by, since we said a month and not a year, it may be somewhat, let's see, 24%. Yeah, actually 24% is not far off. So we'll say $2 in there. If it was a high hyperinflation German style 1923, then I'd want another 100 or 200 or maybe $1,000 back, then. And if in fact is one of the rare cases like England in 1815 when they tried to get back off from the Napoleonic War, tried to get back in gold, I might even have a negative inflation rate. The money might be worth $2 more a year from now if the trend continues, looking at my calendar and deciding. And this conceivably could be a negative factor. The risk will never be. The surest you can be is 100%. So this will never be a negative factor. The originary interest, again, subjective value, unless you're strangely psychological and you're adding other values in here besides the normal ones, like self-destruction and so forth, this will always be positive. So these two will always be positive. Inflation conceivably could be negative. If the government, for some strange reason, and once or twice in history it's happened, actually intervenes to prevent deflation, this could be negative. Now, we add all these three together. This forms the interest rate, and the interest rate is why money costs money. Profit, which we now finish this all off on. What does profit do? Profit comes from two factors, and I like to use, again, the Austrian term, such that profit only applies to one of these two factors, and what these two are, or what is the equivalent of these two, is usually called, at least in the Austrian books I've read, the rate of return on investment. Okay, if we break it down this way, now rate of return investment is exactly the same as the originary interest rate and exactly the same as rent. Given all factors equal, given risk equal, given the same people that you're dealing with in a free market or in a market that isn't being distorted by some sort of intervention, these will all be equal. So the interest rate is 5%, the originary interest rate is 5%. That's what everybody's time preferences adds up to, you know, and it gets averaged out by all 8 rapid exchanges in the marketplace. If it's averaging out to say 5% for the time being, the rent, again with no other risks, or every landlord trusts every tenant trusts every landlord, and so forth, that'll be 5%. The rate of return on investment, what you're going to invest into a business, what you're going to buy tools for, what you're going to set a factory for. You know, people put more of that. You're going to expect 5% return on all your investment, or you won't do it. You're going to say, if it turns out this is, for some reason today we got up and this was 4%, this was 6%, money would flow. People would drop out of factory efforts of investing in factories, and it would shift into interest. If it turns out land was going from 7%, money would flow. The people would shut down factories and go and invest in land. People would stop lending money at interest, and would go off and begin to buy land with it. Again, reverse is true. If land was going at 3%, money was being lent at 4%, and factory investment was going at 6%, suddenly the money would begin to dry up. The land would be dumped on the market and sold because people wouldn't want to keep it, and or rent it, I should say, and it would pour into factory building and so forth. So all of these would tend to equalize out. This is all from Austrianism. This is all from Ludwig von Mises. And as you can see, I think you can see now, it's a massive contribution. That's for all these concepts, all these things which are incredible issues within economics, and which all these incredible political movements and cults and money cranks and crackpots and all the rest come about from not having understood. Two more names left here. I'm not going to get into them at the moment very deeply, but Murray Rothbard's contributions, although he has accepted and popularized everything I just said, and his Man, Economy, and State is sort of a popular rewriting of von Mises's classic, and of course this is a book that we all should want to know. We should all read if we're ever going to understand economics in fullness, rocket in fullness, as Martian would say.
All together now.
You in action. That's where it's all at. Read that book, and you are, as far as I'm concerned, a fellow expert in economics. Okay, Rothbard wrote Man, Economy, and State. He employed it in Human Action. I should mention, very good. There are a couple pages which I would just as soon toss out. For respect out of the man who wrote it, I won't, and I don't like ripping up books anyway, but there are a couple pages which are really bad, one of which is a discussion of the draft. Why it's even in here is an interesting question. But the reality is that von Mises, who considered himself a logical positivist, believe it or not, and in my opinion he wasn't, he smuggled in objective concepts, and also a classical liberal, which to some extent he was, since he did defend the government and the draft and the necessity for having it, even though he tore apart the very foundations of the state. There were flaws, and Rothbard, to a large extent at least, eliminated most of those. What he did was to take the abstract of Austrian economics and apply it not only to the real world, to the extent that people like Wilhelm Röpke, I didn't notice his name is not up on here, or Friedrich Hayek, his name is not up on here. All of these people have applied Austrian economics to some extent too into politics and advising governments and states and how they can best create efficiencies and maximize their rule over other people. Rothbard, however, perhaps alone of all these at the time he was doing it, applied it to say that, or to point out and instruct people that the state shouldn't even exist, that in fact it was uneconomic as well as immoral, and he combined those concepts. Thus, in a sense, Murray Rothbard is the key figure to lead from this great Austrian school and off into our Agorist direction. I would, of course, normally draw the line straight down as far as I'm concerned, but some others might want to put it off at an angle. Kerzner is currently working on something that's very important, and I accept it too. It's called information costs. He's adding a new section to Austrian economics. Again, in the good Austrian tradition, he's dealing with something that has screwed up a lot of people and caused them to run off and form all sorts of political cults. So why don't we cover that? This is sort of a quick bonus here, and then move on. Information costs have to do with the following. Why is there advertising? Why do people advertise? Why don't I just say, I know I need a video cassette, I'm going to go out and buy one. I'll just hunt around until I find one and buy it. In fact, why should I, sit in front of a television or trip across a newspaper and see a billboard up there in the air or whatever? Why does this information have to be put up there? Somebody has to spend money on that, right? In the 1950s, this is a fairly modern thing. I told you, Kerzner is a modern version of Austrian economics, and he's taking on a subject which is a modern issue, advertising. This was not a bit, although advertising goes back, in fact it goes back to the dawn of time, to the dawn of market exchanges of the Greek Agora and before. It didn't become a big concept until the 1950s, because in the 1950s, a phenomenon known as Madison Avenue came along, and suddenly the capital pyramid, which we were discussing earlier, of the advertising agency had reached new heights, and the incredible depth of, looking down and seeing all the stages of production of people who did nothing but advertising, or serving somebody in the advertising field, suddenly became apparent that this was a huge sector of the marketplace. It was incredibly important. Why? Well, it turns out that people, if you think about it, all these Austrian principles are something that are just obvious in the face of it the moment it's pointed out to you. And the fact is you don't know what you need. You didn't know that you need a video cassette. You didn't know there was such a thing as a video cassette recorder until somebody told you. There was information there that was needed before you could even go out and buy one. You didn't know there was a chalkboard. You didn't know there was an introduction to Agorism Intensive until one of us, we spent some effort on advertising and plugging it so that you'd know that such a thing existed and you could come and get it. That information cost has to be paid. It exists as part of the package of buying any goods. Now, in the early days, perhaps the basic information that you only really needed to know is that over on the big rock where a couple of farms are kind of close together and there's a river over there, everybody meets there, when the moon is almost full, about a day before that. And if we all get there at the same time and bring everything we've got to exchange, we can quickly commit acts of agora, commit market acts and trades and go away. And then, the next time, and if we run into anybody, we'll pass those words along freely. That might have been sufficient in those days for advertising. And even then it wasn't. Because suppose I came there, once a month and we met there, and then you told me, well, hey, you work in leather there, you take the skins of animals and poke holes in it, looks good. Well, if you poked holes in this kind of particular pattern, that would look even better and I'd buy it. Darn, if you had told me that a month ago, I'd have it here already. If you'd have told me even a couple days ago, I would have had it here for you. Now you gotta wait all month before we'll get together again. Information costs, a lost sales, right? It goes on and on. I mean, you can build up the depth as much as you want. Kerzner is the one who has come up with this and is spending a lot of time on convincing the rest of the economics world that this is an important issue. And in doing so, he deflates the great attacks on advertising of the huge parasitical construct that somehow sprang up in the economy unbidden and is sucking the lifeblood out of our precious economic bodily fluid.
Yeah, do they take replacement costs and make that an objective element in Austrian economics, or is that too involved with different?
No, and the replacement costs exist and so forth. You'll notice that if you're thinking about what I've been saying for the last hour or so, there's a consistent trend here. I'm talking about only those areas which are peculiarly Austrian, which are not only give these people our value of why they're so great, but also are the areas in which we differ from the rest of the economics world and on which base I'm building everything else, Austrian economics to counter-economics to Agorism and so forth. So, no, replacement costs aren't something that's terribly argued by anybody. Marx would agree with it, Keynes would agree with it, Libretto would agree with it, Fisher, and Friedman would agree with it and so forth. That's not a big issue. But things like information costs were. John Kenneth Galbraith, a paragon of modern economics, didn't understand it, and he wrote all these attacks on this affluent society, which was squandering all its money on this totally unnecessary area. Well, information costs are a secondary feature of this whole calculation theory. Prices, for example, is another Austrian concept, which is it's kind of tied into this objective value thing, which is why I hadn't brought it up separately. But now that you're getting in, you mentioned that, I'll throw it in here quickly. The Marxists, when they taxed profit, what by the way did they think profit was? Well, since everything was labor, profit was again some kind of labor. Since only workers labored, capitalists didn't labor, right? Or as far as we could tell. Since capital was frozen labor, unless these capitalists were frozen laborers, I guess they shouldn't be producing it. They must be taking it from the nice, warm, thought-out labor and freezing it. So that wasn't considered work. Okay, so if it's being extracted from these laborers, if that's the only place it could come from, then these laborers are losing something. They're putting something in, but some of it's being extracted by these capitalists, and that's where exploitation concepts come from. That's where Marxism takes off in this whole capitalists are evil theory. The exploiting class. And it makes perfect sense if you accept the labor theory of value. They're completely right. They follow right from Adam Smith. But in the real world, capitalists do perform a function, and lo and behold, they're being rewarded, sometimes quite amply. Well, it also connects with prices, because if you abolish pricing, if you abolish money, and you'll abolish prices in a sense, but what prices tell you is when it tells you, it says how much of something is relative to how much something else is. It's a rapid calculation and summation of relative abundances. So I'm trying to say that I've got so many books here, you've got so many of that there, we make we come to our own internal subjective value exchange, as everybody else in the room who's interested in this market also gets into it, and they exchange at some price in which all our subjective values are achieved, and everybody else sits back because they didn't want to trade. This is the price is where all these subjective values tables, here's subjective value table 1, here's the same thing at a different level of subjective value, here's another one who's way down there, not even in on the trade. And sort of somewhere along there, a price is set and everything will clear. Everything below that trades. Okay, that's a quick way to look at it. If you don't have prices, they don't know where that trades, and economic calculation, as Mises and others pointed out, are impossible. Boom. The Marxists attempted to abolish prices. They created chaos in their market. They tried to have a command economy. To have a command economy, you have to have commanders. So they set up directors, they set up commissars, they set up people to order things around and set where it goes. And they had 10,000 left shoes and no right shoes and so forth and on, all the way throughout their market. And in fact, important stuff like military defense, which is somehow very important to governments, whether they're on that side or this side of the Iron Curtain, they ended up buying the open world market or using those prices to figure out what they were going to charge internally. So in the end, it got smuggled in the back door. As it turns out, it got smuggled in more than just the back door, and that's what we're going to get into counter-economics tomorrow. But for now, let us pass on. Okay, the last thing, I think I have one more thing I want to do.
Second part of profit.
Well, profit, as I said, okay, yeah, right, rate of return. Yeah, let's just do that one then. That's a good idea. Let's do it this way. Or do it slightly differently, because I want to use the terms exactly as I use them. All right. I can't remember a good term for this, so let us say, there's a good business word for this, but it doesn't come to my mind at the moment. What I want is your investment payoff, I guess is the word I want, is not the word I want, but it's the concept. It includes two cutoff points. It includes the rate of return, and I won't bother repeating the word on investment here. Rate of return, which we know is the same as the originary interest rate, which is the same as the rent, and the same thing that was also an interest, the risk factor. Now this risk factor, the payoff for the risk factor, is what we call profit, and only that.
You got the expected payoff or expected ROI? The term usually put expectation when you introduce a risk factor.
Yeah.
Is it only the risk factor or with?
But the point is, we can deal out two different levels. We can deal out when you're making the calculation and planning to do it, in which case it's an expectation value, or you're dealing with it at the point at which your payoff has already occurred. In which case, what they call
an ROI.
Economic history. Yeah. In which case, it now becomes an actual amount, and that's profit.
So do you think risk and profit interchangeably?
The payoff for risk is profit.
Or loss.
Or loss. Negative profit equals loss, right. In common terms, and this is correct, negative profit equals loss. And in this case, there's no confusion because nobody ever, there's no such thing as a negative return on the rate of return. A negative interest is, except in cases where you have extreme deflation, and that's where you would never have a negative interest rate or whatever. And even that's not originary. So this is always true. Negative profit equals loss. If you want to use a term. Now, when I use profit, I use both plus and minus. It's a payoff for risk, and when you are attempting to make an investment, as Art pointed out, you're going to expect the profit. So you sit there and you figure out what the rate of return is, and see, the point is this. Let's say you're about to make an entrepreneurial, and this whole thing is now the key cornerstone of at least what turned me on Austrian economics and away from the deviation of Chicago School and so forth. Entrepreneurship. The entrepreneur, this means between person, a betweener in French. Enterprise is betweenism, between eyes. The entrepreneur specializes in this activity. And why does he do it? Well, let's say that the entrepreneur happens to be, it's not required. One of the nice things about the pure Austrians is that they don't identify entrepreneurs with capitalists, and I make that same distinction. A capitalist is not an entrepreneur is not a capitalist. An entrepreneur needs the factors of production to accomplish his ends, and they may require capital. Once in a while they don't. So they may require capital and they may require labor. And he will assemble these factors of production, produce whatever is to be produced, and take his payoff. The payoff may be, will be hopefully the rate of return plus his profit. In particular, what makes him an entrepreneur is his profit. If, again, ceteris paribus, all things being equal, 100% surety that everybody's trustworthy, government isn't screwing around with the money. There we are in this wonderful, perfect utopia of economics. Now, what's going to happen? If I'm a capitalist, I'm sitting on capital, I'm sitting on 100 ounces of gold. And all around it, all you entrepreneurs or potential entrepreneurs are running around saying, give me the money for this, give me the money for that, I'll give it back to you with X amount, I'll give it back to you with Y amount. And I'll sit there and say, well, that looks good, that looks good, that looks good. What will happen is that you will, I will look at you guys, I will look at the people who are renting, who might, I'll phrase this, like I said, who own land, who I might buy it for rent, who are working in industries which are completely sure. Let's say Dale is making steel, and steel's been being produced for hundreds of years. He's going to do it exactly the same way everybody else is doing it. There's nothing interesting, nothing risky about it, but hey, it's a good solid way of life there. So Wayne's going to get into the steel industry. And I look at him, and Danny here has decided he's going back to the land. He's going to do it the same old way. He's got the same old concepts, and if I buy this land and rent it to him, he'll be happy. He'll pay me off so much rent and so forth. And Wayne is going to pay me back a rate of return on my loan to him for just for the purposes of building this factory. So I'm looking at it, and everybody else in the market's about 5%. But along comes Kent here, and he says, well, I've got something you haven't heard of. This is called cellular telephones. It's going to blow us out of the water, man. And I'm going to pay, I'm going to make so much, I'm going to make like hundreds of percents on this, but I'll give you 50%. I mean, this is how much I'm sure of it. I'll pay you back. Give me your 100 ounces of gold. I'm going to run in and make these cellular telephones. I got a fantastic expert named Bruce right behind me there. He knows technology down the line, and we can't lose. And I look at him and say, well, I think they can lose, but 50% sounds pretty good, and so I sit there and make my decisions. Now, what I'm making my decisions on, if there was no risk, if there's no profit from the risk, no payoff for that, I'm not going to give him 100 gold ounces. Why should I? There's Wayne, whose steel is a sure thing, and he's going to give me back 5 extra gold ounces in a year. There's Danny, who's going to go back to the farm, be a good peasant or whatever, and pay me back another, the 5. I can sit there and choose between those two, Pretty damn safe. I'm not going to like this. Maybe a weather storm will hit him. There might be risk factors, of course. Maybe the steel market will drop out. In the real world, there are such factors to worry about, and that's an entrepreneurial risk too. But I'm keeping everything ceteris paribus, so that the only case that we're discussing in these three are the basic factors of reduction only, or land only, originary interest only, etc., versus the one with the entrepreneurial risk. And he's got a big factor of risk. I mean, we're talking lots of money there. Who knows anybody ever want to buy a cellular telephone? We won't know until it's done. Okay, so I have to make my decision, and that's when I consult my subjective value charts and decide I want to live a little and make a lot of money, and I go with him and either make a bundle or lose my shirt. So the capitalist is sitting back there. He does make a bit of money. It's impossible to separate these. Now there's another important Austrian thing. Rothbard's going to point this out too. If you take the 3 factors, the 3 economic roles that we play, okay, we're all players on this great stage of life. Economically, there are 3 factors. You can be an entrepreneur, you can be a laborer, you can be a capitalist. Capitalist is a passive person since he just owns things. His only decision-making is whether or not to let it out of his hands and hopefully get it back again. An entrepreneur is a dynamic element that runs around, assembles all these factors of reduction, takes his risks, and he's the adventurer, the gung-ho, the Earl Flynn of the marketplace. The laborer is the guy who just kind of go out there and make a living and put in the same amount of effort, maybe a little less every day, and make a little more for it, but you can count on him to put out. He'll learn skills, he'll improve himself. Well, that's the role play, but in fact, everybody's all of these. The capitalist has to make some economic judgments, he's got to make some risk-taking, he's got to figure out who to trust, who to invest. The entrepreneur has got to have some capital or get some capital. He's got to put in some legwork himself. He's got to pick up the phone and call people if nothing else. He's got to go into meetings, hustle them at gatherings and conferences and what have you. And the laborer has also got to decide which of the jobs he's going to take, which factory is likely to pay him, and then some of them might have a bad reputation. He has to make entrepreneurial decisions. In the real world, all these factors exist. All of them have to be mingled together. But if we extract out the purity, that's what's going on. And the laborer gets whatever value is assigned to him by all the subjective values of everybody who might want something that's ultimately produced from his work after it gets through the factors in the capital pyramid to the factors of production through the entrepreneur, who actually, among other things, is involved in getting it to the consumer and distribution. That, in a incredibly cramped nutshell, is Austrian economics. And from this base, we deal with two aspects. Let's start with this. Suppose there was no such thing as a government. Suppose the state existed.
Imagine there's no government.
Yes, gentlemen, regardless of this, economics did have a similar vision. If that was the case, then the rest of this course would be utterly unnecessary. There's the beginning. You would already know everything there is to know. There would be absolutely no reason to take arms in the sea of trouble. There would be no reason to study people taking arms in the sea of trouble. And on from there on. That would be all there was to it. You could, of course, subdivide, you could integrate it, you could deal with it in depth, you could make great economic history studies, prove all these points. You could continue making studies and find out new things in some senses, like information theory, as Kerzner's working on. Subjective value theory is not that old, less than a century. Mises, with his theory of money and credit in 1910, came up with these time preference theories. We're talking now, the century. Benjamin Tucker was, still thinking about Austrian economics while he was dying, run off to France and was about to die. So his whole economic, Benjamin Tucker, for those of you who are libertarianism isn't good, and you all assured me it was, you should all know was a great libertarian, probably the greatest libertarian of the 19th century. He didn't know any of this, anything we talked about just now. I mean, the very bad, Carl Minger was around, he'd heard, somebody mentioned Austrian economics to Tucker, allegedly, a couple of those more forward-looking people. And that's not all he knew. He didn't buy it. His theory of, he was a basically a theory of value person, and therefore he was suspicious of interest. He was suspicious of rent, and even profit, although and he wasn't too bad at profit because he just assumed there was some sort of strange voluntary agreement. He accepted a lot of the non-ceteris paribus things, like there were other factors why people did things, and he was willing to accept it. If it was self-destructive, it was a form of exploitation, fine, as long as people voluntarily agreed with it, and that's how he crossed the line to libertarianism and was not the Marxian or other form of socialist. Nonetheless, he didn't find any real reason for them, and if he saw these big businessmen and big bankers and so forth, and properly speaking, they were in collusion with the state, then he assumed that somehow the state had something to do with creating it. You all now know better. And from this basis in reality, we can now progress. Well, let's at least take a crack at some of this. What happens when we bring this monster into our lair? What does this do to our nice little economy? Instead of its dripping fangs. Yeah, right. This is it. This is the gloves-off, X-rated version. The state is a concept in which everybody tries to live at the expense of everybody else. It's a great fiction, as some of our great forebearers have said. Edward Konkin, who's not an Austrian, but is probably worth mentioning a couple of times, did a lot of good background on the nature of the state. But in a sense, I'm going to just mention names as we go by, because if I start to try to systematically list every libertarian, we're going to end up in the course of libertarianism here. There are a lot of people. Libertarianism, or anything we want to talk about libertarianism, did not begin with Ayn Rand. In fact, it was incredibly mature and even a bit decadent by the time we get to Ayn Rand. It doesn't begin even with Benjamin Tucker, who I mentioned a minute ago, and even Frederick Bastiat follows in a long tradition. The state itself, where did it evolve? Well, Albert J. Nock, leaning on the studies of German sociologist Franz Oppenheimer, came up with a paradigm that I consider the most likely one, and that's the background of libertarianism. And historically, if we assume we did evolve from the hunter-gatherer through the agrarian stages and so forth, the statists were kind of backward hunter-gatherers who decided to hunt other people. We all know there was cannibalism around. Well, they were a little more advanced than that. They didn't actually eat the people.
Just ate out their substance.
But they were more like a vampire. Vampires, I noticed I had dripping fangs here. Vampires is like an analogy. what they did was, okay, here we have our progressive agricultural communities. They're sort of scattered around here with rivers and mountains and stuff beside them, valleys. And here they come riding along. Ah, there is a rich farmland with a bunch of granaries and stuff. Let's grab all the granary, rape all the women, and ride off and make sure we get in the right order. Okay. And as you know, if you look historically, there wasn't even a lot of that going around. There were people called Vikings. The word Viking, in fact, was not their ethnic or racial or tribal or national name. That was what they did for a living. They went to Viking. What did it mean? Well, it meant to go on boats or occasionally with horses and ride into the countryside after you landed in the port and rape and plunge and pillage. That was it. Hagar the Horrible in the modern cutesy version.
Steal women, rape buffalo.
Right. Good. Rape many buffalo. Okay, so this is what they did for a living. And I guess there was a fairly good living in it. The hunters, since they were used to taking on vicious animals, tended to be pretty good at aggression. And the poor farmers, who didn't have to worry too much about it, scare away a wolf once in a while, probably weren't too good at defending themselves, and that's why things evolved the way they did. Well, anyway, what happened is one day, of course, some of these people did start fighting some of them off. You ever see a movie called The Magnificent Seven, or the Japanese version of it, which preceded it? You'll notice that once in a while they decided to deal with these people, maybe hire one bandit gang to take on another bandit gang. And thus you get things like war. Well, anyway, one of these bandit gangs, or plundering barbarians, whatever, got the intelligent idea of, yeah, if we pillage, rape, and then burn in the correct order, when we come back here next year, there may not be anybody left, and we might have done a thorough good job. So we ought to leave some of them. The dumb jerks will probably rebuild everything and fill their granaries up, and by the time we've gone through our whole circuit riding here and come back to the first one, they'll have rebuilt it and replant it. So we're going to leave them with some of their grain. And we're going to leave them, you know, some of their women and so forth and so on, some of their able-bodied men, and maybe some of this will be reproduced and everything will be back. And sure enough, some of it was. In fact, they might sort of farm the farmers and even keep out other tribes from attacking them. Well, we can go on in this move, but you're beginning to see the point. The key issue was, at some point, the roving bands of barbarians and Vikings, the Normans, in fact, the Normans were one of the great statists. The Romans were the ones previous before them, but after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Normans kind of followed this very well too. They decided to settle there. They stopped there. They did stop their ranging and riding around. They ended up in one or more constellation of these agriculturally based communities with possibly a marketplace in Agora. And they set up in what we now call an institution. They institutionalized themselves. They decided that they would only take a certain amount of plunder, and hopefully the grateful peasants, not having had all their plunder taken and all their women raped and all their village burned down, will continue paying them off regularly. And they would adjust the rates of collection and so forth, and thus you have the beginning of what's known as taxation. That's what taxes are. That's where they came from. The tribute. That's another term. Tribute being the Roman term, tribute. And so it evolved over a period of time. Yeah.
How did they make the transition from just having people view it as plunder to having people view it as tribute?
Ah, well, now we get to the interesting thing. First of all, two sides had to be convinced of this. Okay, you need the sanction of the victim, of course, and the sanction, in a sense, of your fellow aggressors. So, in the beginning, perhaps a very powerful chief with a intelligent advisor probably could keep his own troops in line and maybe just force them to. The local people to go along with it, but it would be certainly helpful if somebody was explaining to these people how wonderfully off they were compared to everybody else. Somebody had to tell them about how they're keeping all the worst bandit gangs that were going to ride in and rob and pillage and plunder them the old way, which obviously was much worse, and so forth. So you get the corruption of things like the priests, which mainly because they were the only ones who did things like study and keep the history and the wisdom of the tribe and so forth, you know, witch doctor type stuff. So they maintained that, and the church became established, and of course the moment you set up an established church, and this is a theme we're going to get into a whole lot, you get a counter-economic church. You get reformations, you get schisms, you get heretics, because they say, wait a minute, this may not be the case. Well, shut up, don't tell everybody about it. We're getting paid off by Mr. Barbarus here, who has just taken over. Hail the great King Barbarus I, who was ordained by the great Sky Father or Earth Mother, or whoever we have to worship this week. There, don't upset the voter, you're a heretic. We're going to cut off our source of supply of tribute. They're going to split the tribute with us. So you build up this whole sociological background. It's ultimately fueled by economics. We're still dealing with the same subject. But now we're dealing with something slightly different. Not slightly different. If there's such a thing as a difference in kind in this area, we're now dealing with it. Because everything we assumed up until now was voluntary. Everything was trade, was exchange. You and I were consulting our subjective values and deciding what we're going to do. Well, Mr. Status comes along and says, I don't care what your values are, I'm taking that. End of discussion. My value is such that I will not only want to take that, but I'm willing to spend whatever is necessary to get you out of the way so that I can have it. And thus the state enters the field. Well, yeah. But fortunately we live in a world, perhaps if you like biblical mythology and so forth, we get the, we may have been cast out of the Garden of Eden, but we still get our little rainbow. And what's the rainbow? What is the saving virtue, the silver lining, and all those neat mythological concepts involved with the evil state having come in? Well, the fact is that the state, there's two things about it. First, the state is parasitical, and we're going to get into what that means. It's non-productive. And secondly, it can't crush economics. It can't overwhelm it. It can intervene, it can distort, it can distract it, but the flow may be bent, but it's going to go back, and it's going to continue on its course. Economics will always assert itself. This also comes from Austrians, because the Austrians consider themselves, whether or not there's politics, whether or not you believe one thing or another, whether you're a socialist or a Catholic or whatever, their economics is not dependent on your values. It is value-free, or in German, wertfrei. And that's another concept of Austrian economics. So, if there's a state around and if statists are making decisions, they're still making decisions within much of what we've talked about. The only aspect that's lacking is the voluntary part that we were talking about. But suppose you want to impress somebody. Suppose you've decided that this sounds pretty good after I've just described it, and you want to take up statism as a way of life. Okay. Well, how do you do it? I suppose there's training schools for them, of course. And, you might.
It's called public education.
Right. And you want to get.
Or even.
If you want to get armed. Well, now this all costs money too. How am I going to get that? I mean, if I want to go and oppress somebody, suppose I want a gun. I'm going to go and walk up to somebody with a gun when I don't have one and say, give me your gun or else. That doesn't sound like it works. We have a basic reality problem here. Okay. So the state, even the statists are controlled by certain limitations in the marketplace. They have to acquire things. And even when they're sitting there with their ill-gotten gains, what are they going to do with their ill-gotten gains? I mean, they can consume some of them. Certainly the institutionalized rape. By the way, some of you people might think I'm kidding about this. I don't know what your historical background is, but historically, up until as recently as the 16 and 1700s, I believe, in France at least, there was a feudal concept called droit de seigneur, the right of the lord of the manor. And in fact, if you were a peasant and belonged to the land, and in Russia, I think it goes into about the 1800s before they freed the serfs, the first night when a peasant and a peasantess were married, the lord had the choice of having the female participant come and spend the first night in his manor to sort of warm her up for the marriage. So this was a form of institutionalized rape that has pursued or maintained itself up to, in some areas, as late as the 1800s.
This is the same day as they're married that the Lord does this?
Yeah, usually that night. Sometimes it varies, you know, how many days it lasts. Sometimes it's 3 days or a week or whatever. I mean, all the details you can look up in your historical books. But taxes was one for, you know, so rape became droit de seigneur, plunder became taxes, and burn and pillage, the burning part and destruction, of course, became what's known as war. All of these have retained and exist today, and they exist in
urban renewal
in the state. Those of you who think that, so those of you who think that, or those of you who run into some libertarians who say the state doesn't exist, it's merely a figment, and we shouldn't even consider it. In that case, of course, there are no burning villages around, there is no rape to be committed, and there's no, at least in that time that we were talking about, and there is no taxation to be collected, right? Okay, well, this is how the state manifests itself, and it continues to do so. What we're interested in here is, I could get into a long historical, and that's what revisionist history is really about, is how the state came from this sort of primitive paradigm down through the Roman period, Carthaginian, Roman, Middle Ages, and down into modern times, the nation state. It evolved the way it evolved for various reasons. Some of them we could accept perhaps were for ideological, political, religious reasons, but ultimately, and this is where we get into what we really are here, economic determinists. ultimately has to do with developing economies, technology. Technology is a product of what's called a progressive economy. This is an Austrian term too, believe it or not, although they did adopt it from general economics. What is a progressive economy? This has some bearing on it. States love them, by the way, but states are incapable of creating them. In fact, the very existence of a state tends to work against it. They're a regressive factor in the economy.
I mean, sort of like a tick is incapable of creating a dollar.
That's a good way of thinking about it, yeah. Progressive economy is one that is constantly growing in wealth or value, or however you want to phrase it. It's conceivable that a society filled with self-destructive people by accident lasts long enough that you could measure what's happening and notice that everybody's subjective value is being fulfilled by all the destruction and chaos going on and people dropping down and dying and suffering horribly. However, if such societies did exist, we certainly don't know about them. They were very brief flashes in the pan and didn't sustain themselves. They seem to run contrary to objective reality. In the reality that we know, progressive economies generally are marked by the fact that material wealth, quite visible, quite measurable, highly subjectively valued by all the people in it, is constantly growing. It is, in game theory, this is known as a positive sum. It's a positive sum game. Okay, what does that mean? Well, there are three kinds of games in game theory: negative sum, positive sum, and zero sum games. If we all sat down here and played poker, which we could do for the next hour, and we put chips on the table. We ignored the fact that somebody had to buy the cards and bring in the beer and the chips and whatever else had to be in, the fact that we're foregoing an hour of our time, again, ceteris paribus, throwing all those factors out, we would have a zero-sum game. If one of us was the house and collected, 1% of each hand, whatever was in the pot for each exchange of hand, and kept draining it off as the game went on, the house would of course gain. The rest of us would come out according to the laws of chance, and that would be known as a negative sum game. In fact, if you add in the house, it's still zero sum, but as far as the players are concerned, it's a negative sum game. If, on the other hand, for some strange reason, I sat here while you were playing, perhaps for illustrative purposes, and started throwing in $10 bills in every other pot or something just to keep the thing going and getting interesting so that the money was constantly building, it could happen that all of you, again, according to the laws of chance, might all come out ahead. Some of you might come out more ahead, some of you with less ahead. Some of you might not come out ahead and somebody else come out way ahead, But it's possible that everybody could come out ahead, and that would be a positive sum game. Okay. In a progressive economy, there is a positive sum game involved. And once you think of it that way, it becomes obvious what we talk about with technology. What is technology, by the way? It is, remember Böhm-Bawerk and the capital pyramid? Technology is yet more layers being added onto that capital pyramid, building it up ever higher. Again, in a progressive, yet another way of looking at these things. If you're talking about something real, if somebody has come up with a theory that corresponds to the real world, you'll notice there are always several ways of describing the same thing. It's sort of it's not intuitively obvious, or it's not something that comes out of any theory, but it is intuitively obvious, I should say. It is intuitively obvious to me, at least, that if you are dealing with something that describes reality, there should be more than one way of approaching the same thing. It's there. It doesn't depend on the theory you described. It doesn't depend on the concepts you build up or whatever. It's just real, and therefore we should be able to approach it from all different angles. So another angle, as I said, on this capital pyramid thing, if the capital pyramid is growing, that's also another definition of a progressive economy. If it's shrinking, if later factors of production are falling here and people are going back towards more and more primitive ways of doing things, it's a regressive economy. It's falling. This gets us into a whole interesting area, which I'm probably not going to cover here, but something to think about when you're reading your newspaper and thinking libertarian thoughts. What if the government is insisting on confiscating so much that they are chewing up this capital pyramid? What does that mean for the economy that you're living in? It means it's regressing. It means technology is being devoured and that things are falling backward. They talk about eating the seed corn when they talk about capital destruction, but in fact it's a lot more damaging than that. It actually lowers the entire standard of living by lowering, and here's where we get into Bob's point, we're lowering the standard of living because we're lowering the capital pyramid because we're lowering the technology. Well, anyway, let us get back here. Okay, so the state, we know, does all sorts of nasty things. It robs, it murders, occasionally or historically rapes. But is it economically neutral? That's a question that many economists have seriously asked. Most of them, thank God, are an Austrian. Well, actually, the Austrians asked for the purpose of answering it. The others have their own reasons. Well, actually, it's a good thing that somebody brought up the primitive priestcraft, the established church concept, because this ties in very much about the other fields of economics. Why is there an Austrian economics and a Chicago School of Economics and a German-Prussian historical school of economics and I suppose you could call a modern Russian Marxist school of economics and so forth? Why do these all exist? Why isn't there one common reality? I mean, you can have schools in a sense within, say, chemistry or physics, but there's kind of a unification there too. They compare their notes with each other and they sit and argue about, well, I'm looking at it this way and you're looking at it that way, but our results are the same, we're at the same point. And ultimately, these are like ephemeral things that sort of merge after a time and they go on to argue about some new point in the frontier of science. But these economic schools kind of sustain themselves. They don't seem to resolve the same way. There is some movement, a very sluggish movement towards that. Austrianism for now is accepted. When I first heard of Austrianism and got into it in the 60s, it was anathema. It was verboten. You would be not merely laughed and scorned, but possibly deliberately failed and kicked out of schools for talking, saying positive things about Austrian economics. I had a friend who went into economics and I went into chemistry, and when we started talking about this, I would say Ludwig von Mises, and he would go, oh, that crackpot, oh, chuckle. He had been well programmed with his faculty. Nowadays, however, times have changed, and Austrians are now just like poor relatives, kind of borderline acceptable if they don't get too pushy. They might be invited to dinner, and they might even be allowed to sit next to the disadvantaged minority groups.
Are they being co-opted?
Well, yes. In fact, many of them have indeed been. Again, the names that I didn't write down but have mentioned before, Böhm-Bawerk certainly was, and Friedrich Hayek is showing a lot of signs of it. There are a lot of others. Friedman is not one of us and never was. We can get into that later, but the whole Chicago school has never been a particularly free market economic school. It goes back to the Fisher-Marshall school. Again, Rothbard, if you want to read more on that, or I don't know what he's written on it, but Rothbard waxes eloquent on the background of Chicago school. He must have had some things in articles in mind. Anyway, getting back to what we're trying to get through here. The question of the state of economic neutral. Well, no. The answer is no. Nothing in a sense is economic neutral. It's sort of a quantum mechanics vision of the world that all waves are touching each other and overlapping, and anything I do has this ripple effect throughout the economy and affects everything everybody else does. That's true. So if that was the only case, just the state was kind of like an institution, like maybe a big company or something, a lot of big partnership of some kind, or people did a lot of things together, it probably wouldn't affect anything. It wouldn't be a big deal. Because regardless of what the muckrakers of the late 18 and early 1900s thought, bigness alone does not really cause a problem in the economy. You can have very big companies or very big attempted cartels of companies who will sort of lurch around and make all sorts of decisions. And people like Ficht and Gould, Jay Gould, and so forth might try to corner the gold market. And what they usually got for their pains was a short-term gain and a long-term loss, because the market would simply flow around them. Remember I mentioned that you can sort of do all sorts of things, but it'll keep flowing around you. If you tried to corner the gold market, gold would go up in price. People would start to sit there and, oh well, it was unexpected, but from now on we'll predict ourselves and operate on the basis that there's a slight, there's less gold will cost more and so forth, and okay, we'll make our trade on the basis of gold being worth 200 bushels a week instead of 100 bushels a week, and the trade goes on merrily while they sit in their gold. Okay, they could spend some of it. They could spend a lot of it, and suddenly gold will go down in price again, and then they will recalculate according to the present amount of gold in the market and go on from there. So there's some profit, some loss, some anticipation, some unanticipation. In fact, if they decided to play this game for a long period of time, there would be little newsletters that would come out, even in the spring market, and call themselves a gold newsletter, and would tell you how to predict that, well, gold, with Jay Gould and Ficht and J.P. Morgan and John Rockefeller the First and so forth might be doing today, and whether or not they decided they're going to corner the gold market. In fact, even today, and even with the state around, all sorts of silver and gold newsletters talk about whether or not the Hunt brothers are going to try to corner the silver market. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Yes. Well, so much for that. In fact, the market does handle that quite nicely. The state, however, is not even that non-neutral, even that sort of, the mathematics the term is perturbation. The perturbation is a distortive effect that can be accepted as a small correction factor. That's, I guess, the best way to phrase it. There are actually mathematical functions which are used for perturbation theory. There's a whole branch of quantum mechanics where they can't figure out what the exact equations are, so they take the ones they know and add perturbation factors to it or attempt them to fit in other equations. Anyway, the state is not a perturbation. What would it be like if the state was, and let's try to conceive of a state that's only a perturbation. And in fact, that's where you get minarchy and the whole limited government concept. The classical liberals, okay, the limited government advocates, the constitutionalists and so forth, attempted to perceive a viewpoint of the state in which it would be a perturbation. They knew that it affected the market in a big way. It is the biggest, most powerful institution in society, whether good or evil, and I think none of us here have any doubts that it does any good. I mean, but let's just assume in a moment, try to think of it as sort of morally neutral, very free, and ask ourselves, what does it do in our society, or what can it do? Can we perceive of it as just something so small, it's a bit of a perturbation? Well, there was an attempt to make it that way. The closest attempts in real history, as opposed to people's fantasies, or in declarations of independences or Atlas Shrugs or whatever. In the real world, the post-American Revolutionary government in the Articles of Confederation state came close. That's sort of the beginning where we can sort of look at that and say, well, how was that? I mean, if we get to that point, we can't see anything else that was sort of smaller and weaker. What about that kind of institution? Well, it turns out that they had a tax rebellion. They had a monetary inflation rebellion, a near revolution that almost overthrew the Massachusetts state government. And most of the people who were on the establishment side of that became extreme agitators for the Constitution. But even in those periods, in that period when they had just overthrown a government, when all the people were filled with free market, pro-freedom, libertarian, proto-libertarian, whatever you want to call it, ways of thinking, they still had so much government that they were obsessed with it, that was screwing up their money supply, that they were still feeling the impression of the taxation, and couldn't wait to get rid of it. And in fact had to be brought back into line by disciplinary measures, and by the time of a couple of years after the Constitution was finally put in, troops were sent in to crush the first counter-economists, the whiskey producers of western Pennsylvania. So, it does seem that the state just can't allow itself to become a small perturbation. It just touches and corrupts and creates great havoc in everything wherever it is. Theoretically, there have been many people who postulated what they consider a small limited government, which should not have this effect. It's some of the Austrians talk about. Let's see if I remember the exact term. Economically neutral, but it's not quite the term they use. They use the word neutral, but the concept of, for example, let's say we had a small government that was sufficiently small for perturbation, whatever that is. Let's just assume it can exist. And then we ask ourselves, how's it going to live? Well, it has to live by plunder. If it doesn't, then it's not a government. If, let's just say we have a voluntary association which is going to do something, it's not a state. I don't care what it's going to do. It's going to protect you, it's not going to protect you, it's going to provide charity or not provide charity, whatever it's going to do. If it doesn't steal any government, it's not a state. So somehow it's got to steal. Now, how can it steal in such a way that it won't affect anything? And a lot of Austrian economists actually made a good living attempting to figure out how the state can do this with having the least impact on the economy. And as Rothbard, who was particularly interested in this particular area because of where his political inclinations lie, they never succeeded. They could not find such a thing as neutral revenue enhancement or taxation. They tried a sales tax, but in fact, sales tax is extremely unpopular with those who profess great bleeding hearts for the people because it's what's called a regressive tax. It hurts the poor more than the rich. And, of course, there are income taxes, and the progressive income tax, some of you are familiar with that concept, was originally proposed because it was supposedly less painful than the other forms. It was supposed to be Less of a problem because it took more money away from the people who could most afford to pay it. And therefore, it should have the least impact on the economy. Of course, the original rates of the progressive income tax were supposed to range around 1 to 3%. And there was an argument with capping it at, what was it, 4%? And they argued against it because, well, it would never get as high as 4%. And therefore, by putting a 4% limit on it, immediately everybody would try to get it right up to the limit so they can collect as much as possible. So let's not encourage them. That's how the income tax was passed in this country.
Oh, good question.
Yet another fine theory shot down by a upbeat fact. Yes?
The progressive economy is one which is expanding, and the regressive is one which is contracting. But the state has reversed the terms when they talk about progressive taxation.
Well,
and regressive. Because when
when you're talking about taxation, yeah, except they're saying their segment, this little monster embedded in the total economy, is growing. You see, when it's progressive taxation, they're progressive. The rest of it's a regressive.
Which would be a more progressive economy, one with regressive or progressive?
Well, a more progressive economy would one which would have regressing taxation, which would have less taxation, period, regardless of how it's set out. There is, however, an additional problem here, and this is where we got into the modern Reaganite supply-side economics, Jude-Wadinsky, and all those, and that gang of George Bush called voodoo economists. Remember again the capital pyramid. The problem with stealing more from those who have more is that those people that generally have more like to invest more. This is an observation. There's no particular hard and fast rule why it should be this way, but in general it turns out this way. It's kind of an empirical fact of nature. So if I've got lots of money, I may only, let's say I've got 10 times more money than you, I may want to live only twice as good as you. And, or if I'm Howard Hughes, I might want to only live half as good as you and invest the other 95%, you know. There are a lot of alternatives and choices in the market, but the point is that I tend to want to invest more and to make more money in the future. That's obviously why there's a payoff to it. Well, therefore, that would tend towards the progressive economy, because if I am making more money and dumping more into the capital pyramid, it's going to grow, and therefore we're going to have more, a higher standard of living, more technology, and all the rest of that stuff. If now you steal away if I want to make more money and you're going to steal away more, I'm going to make less, or at least I'm going to tell you I'm making less. But if I really do make less, then again, there's less money to put in here. I might start taking some out of the capital pyramid, because if it's an income tax, I will just sell assets and therefore not have an income, if that's the way it's defined at the time. And the capital pyramid will start dropping, in which case we're going to go into a regressive economy. So in that sense, I have to use a little chain of logic. What you're saying is true. A progressive taxation leads to a regression of the economy. It's a tendency. It depends on how strong this progressive taxation is, whether it can overwhelm the natural, I will call it natural inclination for everybody to want to better themselves materially in the real world. Now, of course, everything I've said for the last 2.5 hours, you already know, right? This is the basic economics that you're all familiar with that you've already studied. Again, I've extracted only those parts that I'm going to use in discussing counter-economics tomorrow. Okay, I think we've gotten a pretty good background here. Maybe this would be a good time to break for some additional questions, or just somebody want to break it, since we're about halfway through the period right now. Anybody want to throw some questions to begin with?
This business is not a question so much as this business of soak the rich. Ownership is something that's basically something we recognize in all our own minds. You own something only because I and everybody else recognize your ownership of it. Okay? I mean, that's what makes ownership work. Everyone has to recognize it. So, the person that's 10 times richer than me, he has custody of all that money and whatnot, because we all grant him, you know, he's got it. Let's assume he earned it or got it somehow, but he's got it, and we all grant that he owns it. So while I don't own it, nevertheless, you're right, he's unlikely to sit on it. Even if he squanders and spends it, it comes flowing back to me, one way or another. Either he paid for it, invest in something, etc. in the factory where I work, or even if he spends it, then I might get some of it by selling something to him, and so forth. There's no such thing as dead money just sitting there waiting to be looted. People just do not sit on money.
There's a reason for that too, and one of the dangers is people who, you know, the old saying, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. And in economics, that's true too, because when we discuss any economics problem, especially the more elementary the course, the more elementary the level you're studying at, the more we lean on ceteris paribus, and we keep dropping out all these perturbing factors. But once you start putting them back in, it becomes a lot of the errors, a lot of the fallacies that people pick up become obvious, you know, and drop out. They would simply realize that it's not true. In the cases of what you're talking about, if we didn't have let's call it this way, an entropy factor. If you just sit on something, it wears away. Cockroaches will eat your money, you know, paper money or whatever, Gold will, whatever, but gold is pretty good at stuff, but again, there might be a possibility the longer it's sitting there and not doing anything, it might also get robbed, or, wandering criminals might come out, or might even take it out and play with it occasionally and put it back, but then you also might lose a coin now and then.
Even
There's always an attrition factor.
Yeah, if there's no deterioration for you, the fact that it has a time period value to other people means they will come to you and offer you something, their use of it. So even if you have a way of keeping the roaches off of yourself, you'll still be enticed.
Yeah, but you in fact have to pay for that. You have to pay for the roach kill. You have to pay for for somebody or spend your own time and labor finding the coins that slip down in between the couch and so on. There's always a cost. No, and that's absolutely the basic law of economics you can think of. There's always a cost to everything, and it's whether the quality question is whether you choose to recognize it. But everything does have a cost. And that's true. And the point is, since there's this entropic factor, therefore there is an incentive to do something with this capital, to invest it or whatever. If I let it sit there, it's going to attrit. I don't care how well I keep it, how many things I thought of, how carefully I set up the situation and wanted to let it go. There's going to be an attrition factor. There's no way out of it. Entropy demands this of the real world. It's sort of a crossover here between physics and or chemistry and economics, but it's going to be there. And therefore, there's always an incentive for me to do something with it that will replace it to set it up such that it becomes self-regenerating, or even more. And therefore, immediately at that point, I re-enter the market. I become an economic actor, a human actor. By the way, that's something I didn't get into. Why human action? If all of you have read the book, you already know the answer to that question. But the point of Ludwig von Mises, when he used the term, is that all human action is, to him, economic. Actually it should be all human interaction, but it's much shorter when you say human action. It's possible to act in a sense that's not economic. You can conceive of such a way of acting, but in fact, the sort of total universal way of looking at economics that Austrians have, it is all really impossible, because it just say that it's just a couple of consenting adults, and they promise to leave all their economics at home, or wherever they leave it, and go off into a room, seal themselves in, and commit nothing but voluntary acts, and then come out of there and they'll resume their economic roles. Well, unfortunately, it still had economic consequences. The time that they were out of it was times that everybody else's investments and decision-making had to account for the fact that they weren't there. If you choose not to do something, that's also an economic act. If I offered you an investment, you chose not to make that investment, that's an economic act. It has consequences. It has the same consequences, or a set of consequences equivalent to those that if you did choose to make the investment. So no matter what you do or what you don't do, you're an economic actor. And even when you're dead, there will probably be all sorts of economic consequences to do with your corpse's disposition and the property that was accrued to it. Perhaps when your last atoms are totally dissipated in other people's property, you can completely absolve yourself of responsibility. But
what is the economic function of inheritance, since you mentioned corpses?
Yeah, the function of inheritance, this is very interesting. One of the areas that historical libertarian, when I use libertarian, it can mean a lot of different things, as we are rapidly finding out. Historical libertarianism had problems with inheritance. A lot of libertarians hated it, as a matter of fact. Classical liberals were opposed to it, and almost universal. The reason that it came about is that originally the concept of inheritance was very tightly tied in with aristocracy. And from the 1700s on, aristocrats, the aristos, were the big enemy of the libertarians. One of the things they probably didn't tell you in school, and probably even most of your libertarian mentors or whoever you read didn't tell you, is that most of the people of the French Revolution who were busily chopping heads off aristocrats would be about this close to us politically right now. They were, Robespierre was a staunch free trader, he was a staunch free enterpriser, did not believe in government control. He had to have his arm twisted, literally, on the directory to even accept the assignats, paper money inflation, the price controls. And it was kind of funny, because he was kind of left with the job of cleaning up the mess after they passed the price controls. Because the violence of the French Revolution, okay, the massacre, the 100,000 people of Thermidor that were killed in the execution. I happen to be studying the French Revolution for other purposes right now, so I'm fresh on the subject. But it turns out that the reason was, it essentially came all about from paper money, which resulted in them trying to cover up the inflationary effects of price controls, and then attempting to enforce them by the age-old status method of executing everybody who violated the prices. And that's where the whole thing came about. Until that, the French Revolution ran for several years. For the first 3 years, the violence was almost non-existent. The king remained intriguing with his queen, also intriguing, not necessarily in the same direction, and so forth. The aristocrats were running around conspiring, and the Illuminati was running around, the Freemasons. And it was a fun time from about 1789 to 1793 for 4 years. And then the inflation effects hit. And people were starving, and they rose up in the streets and attacked, started grabbing people and blaming them for the problems and executing them. And that's when the Reign of Terror actually hit. It was not, it had nothing to do with the revolution per se. It had to do with the setting up of the state, the setting up of a monetary system and price controls. Incredible. And Robespierre, as I said, who's normally the man that you think of as the most bloodthirsty butcher of them all, was just a good old Libertarian Party type person who happened to get into the system and try to make it work. And he found himself caught up in this whole thing, and of course he ended up getting his head chopped off. Yes, for those of you who know the story. Anyway, I don't know if that directly answered what you were saying.
Unless somebody inherited something from Robespierre.
No, back to inheritance, right? We kind of wandered off into the subject of interest right now. Well, that's what they hated aristocrats, and the aristocrats' power, the entire power of the upper class, back when we had upper, middle, and lower classes. The upper class's power was landed wealth. They inherited it, and the way they kept it together is there was two factors. They inherited it. I mean, inheritance was key to it, but also a thing called primogeniture. It means the firstborn inherited it all. Now, these aristocrats often have big families, and the reason they had big families, because I suppose they like to do what raise big families, but the real reason they had big families was, if you think about it, modern wealthy people, climbing up the middle class and so forth, do not necessarily have big families. In fact, the evidence is the opposite. You tend to have smaller families. There seems to be economic reasons for this. But the aristocrats, who were pretty rich in their time, had big families. Why? Well, it has to do with the whole concept of succession. It was important to have heirs and keep the family going and so forth. And actually, being a second, third, fourth son, let alone a daughter, was not terribly useful life. Most of these people, the most useful thing they could expect to do was either be knights, as you see the Monty Python routines, running around hacking at people with big amounts of metal on you or whatever, or else you could, or else later on in the 1600s you just became decadent and had a lot of parties. If you were a female, you just hoped for a good marriage so you could bind a couple lines and combine some inheritances, and you'd be useful in that way. That was basically, if you weren't going to be a lord, that was what all you could look forward to in this family, unless, of course, the person above you in the line of succession died off, and sometimes they were helped on their way, but those who did not want to remain drones all their lives and decided they wanted a more challenging career, that was the only way they could make the career moves. So a little bit of Lucretia Borgia liquids, potions helped them on their way. Okay, well anyway, this was considered a big barrier. The early free-market oriented classical liberals all saw inheritance as a big barrier to entry. It kept the land together, kept it together for purposes which might not be what the market would choose if these people could sell it. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the third thing. Inheritance, primogeniture, and entailment. You have to have all three. What's entailment? It means that the land can only be used for one purpose. It is entailed, it is bound, it is co-contracted, except the contracts aren't voluntary. It is stuck with a particular use.
Oh, you mean zoning?
That's a hangover from that, yeah. In fact, I don't know what they call it in the U.S. In Canada, they had the difference between fee simple ownership of land and fee tail. Tail meaning entail.
They have that here.
They do have that here, okay. So you're familiar with that. In my grade 11 law course, we had a half-year law course, they brought up concepts like that. And fee tail is simply a long-standing holdover from the entailment concept, and that, at least in the British Commonwealth, exists in a vestigial form even today, but it's not tremendously important in economic terms. However, in those days it was. I mean, huge amounts of land were entailed, and peasants were stuck in it, and so forth. Even when they abolished serfdom, the former serfs and peasants could either stay there and work, or they'd have to leave. And, go find virgin land out in the wilderness, or when there wasn't too much of that in Europe, so they ended up in the cities, or they're working in the new factories, and so forth and so on. So there was always an attempt to break this down, and we get into things called agrarian reform, which is an issue even today in Central America. The modern aristocrats in Central America don't have the same titles, but they do intend to inherit it. There's an oligarchy in El Salvador of about 300-400 people, which seems to operate on that basis. and they've reconstituted the aristocracy without necessarily calling themselves that. So the beat goes on there. So the classical liberals hated inheritance because it was part of this total. If you got rid of any one of those, though, you would pretty much break it up.
Who originally enforced entailment? Where did that originally
The state.
come from?
Oh, well, how far back it goes, I don't know. You have to go back to the origins of the state to some extent. One assumes the barbarian kings, when they set up their system, wanted to make sure their heir princes would continue along the same line. The nobles, the aristocrats, were in fact all princes themselves. They were all originally barbarian leaders who recognized a leader above them, and thus you get these kings over the land. The Normans had all sorts of, the dukes at one point, and the earls, and all these other systems, barons, were totally independent. In fact, there are still areas where they are. You have these little duchies and principalities. For example, Luxembourg is ruled by a Grand Duchess, or Grand Duke if male heir comes up. And it was just a duchy. It never had a king. It just happened to manage to be independent at the right time, and it never got all the way up to king level. So all these aristocrats, at whatever level we're talking about, whether they're earls, barons, marquises, up to dukes, I guess is the one just below kings, or were themselves barbarian, descendants of people who won their area by conquest. In modern times, or semi-modern times, say 1700s and so forth, some of these lordships were granted by the king. That is to say that people who were commoners did not have to go out and conquer their own by blood and iron. The king decided they were lord of such and such, and that was all there was to it. But historically, these all the titles, all they called them that method. That's where they come from. And that's why they were entailed, because the lord was the conqueror, wanted to make sure his kid got it, and his kid's kid got it, and so forth. On and on and on. Perpetuated. So they wrote it into law. They encoded it. And those handy little establishment priests, who were also known as clerics because they did all their the writing of the time. They were the only people who could write and keep records, kept track of all this stuff. They were the first bureaucrats, the first civil servants. In fact, the term clerk, which is almost synonymous with the form of civil servant, originally comes from cleric.
So, is inheritance libertarian?
Okay. Now, what happens? Well, we can answer the question by looking at what would happen if each of these elements were there or not. If you break entailment, okay, then it turns out that you no longer have a problem, right? Just that alone can destroy the whole system. Primogeniture is bad. I mean, it slows things down. But within a generation, the first son can sell. Give him a little economic pressure, and he'll just sell off the land. And whoever he sells it to can now, he might decide to break up the land into 2 or 3 chunks, and everybody, each of those persons can break it down again, and it will quickly find the optimal size of the market. And some of the fields will be enclosed, some of them will become planted, some of them will build factories, and within 2 generations at most, it'll all completely filter in the market. So even primogeniture isn't the problem, and inheritance isn't the problem, it's the entailment. And the entailment is purely statist, and that was the key to the issue. But at the time, they saw this as sort of a package deal, and that's why the classical liberals really hated it. They saw inheritance, primogeniture, and entailment as sort of one concept, one unified concept, and they didn't see it much else. When it became a question of the bourgeoisie, that is to say those who had made their own wealth in the towns, that's where the burgher or townspeople came from, middle class, as it became known, the people who made their money by the entrepreneurial and capitalist methods, they wanted to pass on their wealth, then it became a whole new issue. They, first of all, generally didn't entail it, and didn't have the power to entail it because they weren't aristocrats. They weren't allowed to use this noble method, They couldn't be allowed to think of themselves as good as aristocrats, so they weren't granted the power to entail anything. So, in their case, they inherited, but if they had a spendthrift kid, the resources quickly worked its way back into the market for some go-getting entrepreneur to use more productively, and if they were not spendthrift, if they were themselves chips off the old block, then they could invest and use it. So, in that sense, there's no libertarian problem at all in pure inheritance, and even primogeniture, in the sense that I could make a will voluntarily. My children are not inherently entitled to anything. There's no particular reason why they should be. They just come in this world, tabula rasa. And again, if you want to argue libertarian theory, we can go into this, but there's no particular reason why the child has any claim on you whatsoever. A few people, Rothbard and Tucker, argued about this. In fact, Tucker argued that you own the child, not vice versa. Some of the modern people want to have it the other way around. But let's assume everybody sort of starts off equal, nobody owns anybody else, which is what most libertarians would like in a society. In that case, the child has no claim to you. But you may, for your own reasons, after all some of your genetic tissues mingle in there, a lot of people have some sentimental attachment to that, want to dump a lot of your property on them as opposed to anybody else. Now, if you're in the heavy life extension, maybe you don't think that'll ever come up. But up until recently, that's been a big issue. So you're going to want to dump a certain amount on your kid. And you could voluntarily contract, since the kid will take whatever he can get, he's not entitled to anything otherwise, you can give him a contract saying, okay, kid 1, kid 2, and kid 3, sorry, kid 2 and kid 3, you're going to get this and this, but kid 1 gets the important stuff as far as I'm concerned. You know, you get the house and he's going to have it all by himself. I don't want him to break it up for the land, you know, keep the farm together and so forth. That's primogeniture. It could exist in a free society. But it wouldn't be a universal institution, would it? Because some parents are going to say, that oldest son of mine is no good. He's a wastrel. He's a bum. I'm not going to give him, you know, I'm not going to give him one blade of grass, one stalk of corn. Now my second child, the daughter, now she knows how to farm. I'm going to give it to her. But unfortunately, I have to give a little something for the no good bum. And I'll break it up. And I'll give him a little bit and give her a lot. So there goes primogeniture right out the window.
How does this entailment work exactly?
Yeah. Entailment is that it goes to the, okay, for the primogeniture parts, it's going to the son, and the entailment says that the son can't do anything with it. He's stuck with it. It's got to remain intact. The land is manorial. It will always be manorial. It can only be used for certain purposes. You can, you got to give a lot of it to peasants to serf on. You got to keep up the peasants. You know, they have rights too. This is sort of a mingled thing where the peasants can claim certain rights on the land, on the lord of the manor too. They have to keep up the commons, and we have meetings once in a while, and commit to droit de seigneur if they're letting me go back on them. What do you mean you don't want my wife on the first day? Isn't she good enough for you? What is this? You're going to poison the peasant-lord relations we've had? You've got to take her, my lord. You know? So all sorts of things could happen like that. Anyway, you know, people learn in a repressive atmosphere if they're brought up with that, to think that way. But whatever, there's a whole series of binding involved, and the entailment is just that part which says that the property in question cannot be used for anything except what was specified.
Well, does that sort of imply that the concept of having covenants on property would be non-libertarian?
Covenants is a step towards entailment, but it would not be, but the libertarian question is still not involved. See, we, the modern libertarians who are really hip about these things, realize it's the concept of the state that's the problem. The classical liberals haven't shook that yet. Okay, they were still trying to figure out the best state. They thought they had come up with an idea that the state, if it came out from the people, res publica, they came up with this concept of a republic. Therefore, it would be all right. The only bad state was the one that came down from these barbarian kings. Well, the problem was that this whole institution, the state itself, evolved from the barbarian. You know, the institution came to be the way it was because of the origins it had. And therefore, if you were going to set up another one, even if you wiped out the whole aristocracy, if you wiped out the entire descendants of the original barbarians that set this up, you would still have, when you set up the institutions, you're just going to fill the notches, the niches in this ecology, if you want to look at it that way, by exactly the same people. You know, the dogs would now become frogs if they needed flycatchers in this ecology, right? And in the same way, the great Republicans, the great defenders of the people, as soon as they were put in the position, which was originally created for plundering barbarian leaders, they would become probably plundering barbarian leaders, and they would act in that manner. And thus you perpetuate the state. So that's what happened with republicanism in the 1700s. Republican used to be an incredibly radical word. It was almost as, I mean, they didn't think of anarchists. Anarchists didn't exist in that time. Republican was worse than commie. If you call somebody Republican, say you were a minor lord or a daughter or son of a lord, and somebody calls you Republican, out comes the glove. I mean, come on. We'll see you at dawn with my second and my pistol. So how dare you? It was a curse, vile. You wanted to rip up the order of society and babies to starve in the street, you're a Republican. Well, obviously, you have absolutely no virtues or values whatsoever. You follow a person without honor.
Was Democrat ever a slang?
Democrat is Democrat is a separate history. For example, there's no, you can and do have so-called democracies under kings and under aristocrats. You have these multiple houses and so forth. You have constitutional monarchs. For example, nobody argues whether or not England's a democracy. They think it's close enough as far as they're concerned, and yet it's not a republic. Certainly never, England has never been a republic with the possible exception of Cromwell's protectorate. And even that legally was a fiction. They still had a fiction that the king was going to come back someday. So democracy is a separate a separate evolution.
Yeah, I just wanted to know if it was ever a slanderous term or not.
Yeah, oh yeah, well, it was originated, as a matter of fact, democrat was originated as a negative term pejorative by Aristotle. Aristotle talks about the good way of organizing society. The best way is having a philosopher king. If you can't have a philosopher king, you have an aristocracy is the next best thing. And as you go down the hill, the third way is to have the people run it reasonably and rationally, and you have a polity. So what happens when you pervert those? You can the one nice thing about Aristotle is he was willing to accept good and evil here. And so let's say you flip it over. Well, if polity wasn't so good, and also the perversion of polity isn't so bad, so that's the perversion of polity is democracy. So originally, a democrat was a bad polity, a bad politician, I guess. Oh, they use politician as a word, a politist. And a bad aristocracy, one that was not containing virtue, one that was obviously out only for nasty stuff, became as known as an oligarchy. And a bad, since the best of all things was a philosopher king, the worst was a perverted philosopher king, and of course the opposite of a tyrant. So these are the good terms, and these are the bad terms. And democracy was originally a bad term.
Talk about,
But notice it goes back a long ways. The Republic come from this time too, actually. Plato used it before Aristotle. All this stuff comes from the Greek. That's why they all sound like Greek words. Agora is also a Greek word, by the way.
in an agorist society, would inflation solely come from fractional reserve banking, you think?
Well, we get to a whole big issue here. In a free market society, we'll start with that. In a free market society, the question is, would inflation exist? Well, now we have to decide what inflation is. Okay. Go back. Well, I should have left the state on because it's a problem. I guess we can just...
Let's just erase the state once and for all, right?
Well, it keeps coming back until it's erased from everybody's minds, or at least it's associated
State of mind. You can change your mind.
or else it has that sort of toilet training negativity that
Yeah.
automatically you react negatively to it and it doesn't come back. I guess that's what we can hope for in the future. We have bitten the tree, the apple or the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and it won't go away. Just like those who can't stand nuclear power and nuclear energy. Unfortunately, the nuclear genie will not go away because we know it exists. And even if it was banned today, one of us, for example, in this very room might go out and make our own little bomb.